This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On May the 15th, RCMI's resident Romanist, Eric Morse, gave the 13th Val Ross Lecture in Roman History to Military History Night. His topic, The People Are Revolting, Praetorians versus Protesters, 238 AD.
Oyez, oyez! All rise for the chair of Military History Night, James Ellis, His Excellency, Lord Prefect, Lord Praetor, and Lord whatever else. We speak the ritual words, is this thing on?
I think I'm finding out what I've got myself into this evening. All right, this is a little different. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's Military History Night. I'm the event chair, James Ellis. So, thank you. So, tonight's speaker really doesn't need an introduction because so many people here know him, and I see you're a popular guy considering the amount of people that are here, but I'm going to give him an introduction anyway because it wouldn't be fair. So, tonight's speaker joined the Canadian Department of External Affairs in 1973. Over the course of 13 years, and somewhat to his own bemusement, he found himself the resident Ottawa expert on the more politically nuanced questions of international elite and Olympic sport. It was, by his own, and apparently everyone else's admission, the best job in government as it came with hockey tickets. Leaving government in 1986, he spent some time in consulting to public and private bodies in cultural and business relations with Russia, during which time he developed his famous and finely honed cynicism. His association with the RCMI began in 2003. He currently sits on the Defense and Security Studies Committee and serves as the RCMI's Director of Publications. He is also the reason that those watching this presentation online are able to do so. He has contributed opinion editorials on aspects of military and geopolitical affairs to mainstream Canadian media, and in late 2014 he published a book of essays, Roman Spaces, exploring facets of the Roman geopolitical experience. Tonight we're about to hear one of his famous lectures on that subject. Please give a very warm hand to Eric Morse.
Thank you, James. And before I get into the meat of the topic, I would like to thank the museum for having put these priceless relics on display as a trophy around the podium. They, all except for the sword, which belongs to me, they will be featured in the museum auction, which takes place tomorrow, and which is why Randa... Oh no, Randa's still with us, which is why Randa will be absquatulating in the next few minutes to finish working on it. But I also want to do the soft launch of Randa's first day as curator of the museum of the RCMI. Randa, would you stand up and be recognized? The appointment was made this morning. It was confirmed by Bill Hines, who can't be with us tonight, by email to all and sundry, and she will have her hard introduction tomorrow. But welcome, Randa. Now,
Eric, the mic.
The mic? What about the mic?
Turn it on. You have to be near it. You have to be close.
Oh, help us.
More intimate.
More intimate. Okay.
Your
Oh,
Dutch coat.
here! My God! I may have to bellow because I'm sitting, but let's try this. Any better? Okay. Oh, yes, I have to push the slides button, too. So, tonight we're going to talk about the strange, chaotic, exciting, confusing, and maybe just a little bit lethal events of the year AD 238. And to set the context, we'll be stepping into the Wayback Machine to go back a few more decades to give ourselves the run-in and the stage setting. It worked. By heaven. In 27 BC, the Emperor Augustus refashioned the traditional institutions of the Roman Republic into a functioning entity called the Principate, after his working title of Princeps, first citizen. It was a thinly disguised authoritarian state, and as the years wore on, the disguise became thinner. Can everybody hear?
No.
What do you mean, no? I'm bellowing. We'll try. Any better? Because that's as good as it's going to get, I fear me. Come on. It was a thinly disguised authoritarian state, and as the years wore on, the disguise became thinner. But it continued to work pretty well, and then not quite so well, until early in the 3rd century AD. In the 220 years between 27 BC and 192 AD, the empire was generally safe and peaceful. Allowing for the occasional breakdown, it suffered very few major attacks across the frontiers. More remarkably, it suffered even fewer civil wars, especially when we consider that the imperial succession was very rarely guaranteed, even between the members of the same family dynasty. The first internal meltdown happened in AD 69-70 between Nero's suicide and the accession of Vespasian, when, as Tacitus says memorably, because he always says things memorably, a secret of empire was revealed, that emperors could be made in other places besides Rome. And they called that year the year of 4 emperors. The second internal meltdown happened after the assassination of Commodus in 192, and they called that the year of 5 emperors. 2 short-lived emperors were put up and disposed of in Rome, and then the 3 major army groups of the day, Britain, the Danube, and Syria, squared off to slug it out for the main event. The victor, after 3 years of fighting, was Septimius Severus from the army of the Danube. He was a very competent but very ruthless man who didn't even try to cooperate with the civilians. His dying words to his son were, "Stick together, pay the troops, and to hell with the rest of them," which can stand as a milestone in the breakdown of the social contract between the imperial regime and all of its diverse constituencies over the previous 2 centuries. Now, I'd like to give a quick shout out here. The color portraits that you're seeing in this talk are a collateral benefit of COVID. They're the work of Toronto designer and cinematographer Dan Vauchart, who used his enforced leisure and AI software skills during the lockdown to create photorealistic portraits of the first 54 emperors from existing contemporary sources. Septimius Severus founded a dynasty that traveled a pretty rocky road from 211 to 235. All of his dynastic successors were assassinated, which was some kind of a record, I guess. They were also the first dynasty with substantial family connections outside Rome, to Syria, in fact, and it doesn't get much more outside Rome than that, where Septimius, in his time as governor, had married a princess and priestess named Julia Domna, who then brought 3 other Julias to Rome with her, and for the first time, Romans were not entirely sure where their rulers' loyalties really lay, in the traditional base of Roman power, Italy and Rome itself, or somewhere off in the mysterious East. And there was this sneaking suspicion, even at the time, that anyway there were far too many Julias. Anti-immigration prejudice goes back a long, long way. By the late 220s, pressure on the frontiers was mounting steadily, and the emperors had to contend with both external threats and internal unease. They perforce began spending more and more time in theater rather than in Rome, and thereby hangs our tale tonight. 3rd century Rome was a city of perhaps 1.2 million people, the biggest on earth outside China, and most of them were urban proletariat. They generally disliked the aristocracy, but they had an intimate relationship with the emperors. They had been known to get feisty over the years, but bread and circuses usually kept them manageable. The bread was the social safety net. Hundreds of thousands of citizens were entitled to free food of a growing variety, in fact, a guaranteed basic income, which is a phrase we might recognize. The circuses were the chariot races and the gladiator shows, which were not only a way of passing time, but an effective forum for political dialogue. In the Colosseum or the Circus Maximus, the the emperors had an audience of tens of thousands. The Roman people had an audience of one. There were no motorcades with smoke windows, no helicopters, no way of isolating yourself on public occasions. You just had to stand up and take it, because if you didn't, you'd take it anyway, but worse. By and large, the emperors did stand up and take it, with the not inconsiderable help of the Praetorian Guard. But as they began to spend more time away from the cities, the social ties that bind began to fray. The people of Rome felt that he was their emperor and had no business being away, even if he did send food and money. The Praetorian Guard are probably most famous for the number of emperors they personally overthrew in the course of a tempestuous career, thereby giving us the modern term Praetorianism as a fine bad example of transferal of power, and incidentally why it may not have been such a great idea for the commander of the DC National Guard to call them his Praetorian Guard back in 2020. We have yet to see whether that sticks. In recent years, they've been occasionally compared to the Waffen-SS, but that's pretty specious. For one thing, the Guard lasted 300 years, the SS maybe 8 at best, and for another, the SS never even overthrew even a single Führer. As to uniforms, they're tied, both snazzy. For more useful recent analogies, we need to look to the senior Latin American juntas. They were founded, again with some Republican smoke and mirrors, as a personal guard cum political police by Augustus, who took pains to keep them low profile. They dressed in civvies inside the city, and the unit on security rotation at the palace wore togas. That lasted for about as long as Augustus did, and thereafter the infamous prefect Sejanus, who, as you recall, went on from being a Praetorian prefect to commanding the Starship Enterprise, who concentrated them in one camp within the city limits as an open demonstration of force. They began their career of interfering with the imperial succession, and no emperor could really turn his back on them. Here's Claudius openly pandering to them on a coin. They were purged. I mean, you take a look at that. Open pandering right out in public. They were purged in 69 by Vitellius. They were purged again in 70 by Vespasian, and again in 193 by Severus. Each time they were replaced by troops promoted from the regular legions, which also didn't sit well with anybody in Rome because they had terrible manners. And each time, anyway, the new bunch rapidly developed a corporate interest of their own. They began as bodyguards and internal security troops, but as the emperors spent more and more time on the frontier, their combat performance improved perforce, while they also grew from about 6,000 under Augustus to maybe 1,600 under Severus. There was always a large element left in Rome, and after 197, Severus stationed one of his 3 new legions, Second Parthica, just outside the city in Albanum. Parthica used to be thought of by modern historians as a strategic reserve, but that's silly given marching speeds. In fact, they were a political counterweight to the Guard. The Russians do exactly the same thing now with 2 guards armored and 1 FSB division stationed just outside Moscow. In the early 230s, the last Severan emperor was a boy, Severus Alexander, who was effectively dominated by his mother Julia Mamaea. In 233, he'd been out east fighting a not very successful war against the Persians, when the German Confederation of the Alemanni, which means everybody people, came across the Rhine into Upper Germany within striking distance of Italy. The political center of gravity reasserted itself in a hurry, and Alexander marched 3,000 miles to begin positioning a very large army at Mainz for a counteroffensive. The army was in position by early 235, and then Alexander decided to try diplomacy and pay off the Alemanni. It was hardly the first time that had ever been done, but at that point, the army seems to have had it with Alexander and Julia, and they threw a putsch, which put a serving general, Maximinus Thrax, into power at Mainz. Maximinus ruled from early 235 to the middle of 238 AD. He was a giant of a man, and allegedly the first legionary ever to discover a marshal's baton in his knapsack. Some of the primary sources say he was a barbarian, that is, from beyond the frontier, but inner empire writers found it hard to distinguish frontier ethnicity in practice, and as we shall see, had every reason to denigrate him after his death. Thrax, as his name implies, was certainly a Thracian from the East Balkans, of the same ethnic origin as Spartacus the Gladiator 3 centuries before. By 235, he was a general with a decent service record, but he seems to have been as rude, crude, and lewd as the day he joined. He was a very large, tall man with strong features, and feet so big they became a byword in the next century. People used to call men, extremely large men, Maximinus's boot. The sources say he was 8'3" tall. He must have been really something to see at mess dinners. Following the putsch, and significantly 2 abortive counter-putches by Syrian elements in the expeditionary force, he then carried out a massive and very successful surge into Free Germany. But he faced 2 major domestic problems, one political and personal, the other economic and structural. He wasn't quite the first emperor who never visited Rome. That privilege belongs to the very short-lived Emperor Maximinus, who was acclaimed in the East and never left it. Incidentally, he was also the first and probably the only emperor of color, which had nothing whatever to do with the fact that even in the space of a year, he had had trouble with the city populace. By the next century, Rome wasn't even a capital city anymore. But nobody could have known that at the time, or could have known that the absentee emperor was a shape of things to come. What Maximinus entirely failed to grasp was the personal and political relationship between the emperor and the city that was unlike any other in the empire. The economic and structural problems were even more important. Surges cost money, a lot of it. Alexander had wanted to try paying off the Alemanni, but with the Persian theater still unresolved, and a large and restive army at Mainz, that was not going to happen. But putschs also cost money, and Maximinus had to pay bonuses out of ready cash to the troops, and there wasn't a lot of that handy. On top of which, however much loot there was in Germany, most of it was livestock and recruits, so the German campaign hadn't shown a cash profit either. There's one often overlooked, very important difference between the Roman Empire and any modern state. The empire and empires afterwards were cash and carry all the way. There was no national debt, nor even the remotest concept of one. If you didn't have it, you couldn't spend it, emperor. Decent emperors tried very hard to balance the books, but too many financially desperate and/or unscrupulous emperors simply confiscated. Maximinus was a general, put in power by other generals, mainly in response to what they seem to have seen as an urgent need for more military leadership and less Julia. His only real concern was for the army, and his only concern for the empire at large was how much ready cash it could produce for the army. He was so oblivious to everything else that he didn't even bother to replace most of Alexander's senior provincial officials, except for the financial procurators who could get him the money. By 237 at latest, taxes were crushing, and treason trials and confiscations were in full swing. And then he cut the social safety net. The city of Rome was nowhere near economically self-sufficient. The urban proletariat depended almost entirely on the in-kind welfare system of grain and other foodstuffs that had come into existence in the last century of the Republic and never stopped growing until the 5th century when everything fell apart. Lowering the welfare payments threatened starvation. Exactions in the provinces broadened unrest. And even the army wasn't all that happy. Maximinus seems to have been playing favorites among the units, in particular slighting the Easterners. He also seems to have forgotten that soldiers have relatives. The large element of the Praetorian Guard who were with him in theater, plus Second Parthica, who were also in theater, were based in Rome, had relatives directly affected by the cuts, and were getting nasty letters from home by the basketful because these relatives were also literate. By March 238, the pot was boiling. The emperor was in headquarters at Sirmium on the Danube when the lid blew off in one of the more unlikely places, the province of Proconsular Africa, modern Tunisia, one of the most productive and densely settled regions of North Africa. It had no garrison at all, and its governor at Carthage, a senator named Marcus Aurelius Gordianus Sempronianus Romanus, was about 82 years old. He was presumably not much interested in real governing, the more so as he was a Severus legacy and would have been staying well under the radar of the new regime. His nominal subordinate, the financial procurator, was another and altogether nastier kettle of fish. He was a Maximinus appointee. He set about raising funds to meet Maximinus's requisitions, and he threatened to ruin the landowning class with his exactions. Matters came to a head in a major city, in fact the second city of the province, called Thysdrus, now known as El Gem. Our best contemporary source, Herodian of Antioch, tells the story con brio. The procurator of Africa was a man who performed his duties with excessive severity. He handed down extremely harsh decisions and extorted money to win the emperor's favor. Maximinus always appointed men who subscribed to his way of thinking, and who does that bring to mind? The treasury officials at that time, even if they happened to be honest, which is rarely the case, foresaw their own risks and knew the emperor's avarice, and acted as dishonestly as the rest, even if they did so against their will. And then the procurator of Africa began litigation against some young men of the wealthiest and most aristocratic local families, and undertook to extort money from them and rob them of their inheritances. Angered by this, the youths promised to pay him money, but requested a delay of a few days. Calling a meeting, they won the support of all who were known to have suffered an injury or feared that they might suffer one. They also ordered the agricultural workers to come into the city at night armed with clubs and axes. Obeying their master's orders, the workmen entered the city in a body before daybreak, carrying arms for hand-to-hand fighting hidden under their clothes. A large number assembled, for Africa, which is a heavily populated province, has many farmers. When dawn was approaching, the youths appeared and ordered the mob of workmen to follow them as if they were simply part of the crowd. They directed the workmen to take their positions and, keeping their weapons hidden, to resist bravely if any of the soldiers or the people should attack them to avenge the deed they were plotting. Carrying daggers under their robes, the youths approached the procurator as if to discuss the payment of the money. Then, attacking him suddenly, they stabbed and killed him. When his bodyguards drew their swords in retaliation, the workmen pulled out their clubs and axes and, fighting for their masters, easily routed their opponents. Herodian may be being a bit disingenuous here. He makes it all sound very impromptu, but more likely the sons of the nobility were a sort of junior league home guard doing local policing and generally keeping the peasants in line. But home defense militias were seriously illegal in the empire, so you couldn't come right out and say that in public. The young Turks, or young Tunisians, or young whatevers, were now faced with the classic question that bedevils every revolution the morning after. What do we do now, guys? Being stuck for an answer, they went to Governor Gordian, who was also in town at the time for the provincial assizes, and offered him the purple. And apparently they did it with some conviction. Accept the offer, and Maximinus might kill you later, but we'll do it right now if you don't. Sources differ as to whether Gordian was horrified or flattered. Herodian plumps for both, but he took the offer and the surname Africanus, and he promptly elevated his son, also Marcus Antonius Gordianus Sempronius Romanus Africanus, and now to be known as Gordian II. Gordian Sr. wrote to the Senate of Rome telling them there was a new claimant in Africa. The delegation of staff centurions that carried the dispatch was also ordered to kill Vitalianus, Maximinus's Praetorian prefect in Rome, which they did. The Senate promptly recognized the Gordians as legitimate rulers, declared Maximinus a public enemy, pulled down his statues, and purged anybody they could find who was too prominently identified with the regime. You know how these things go. Everyone except Maximinus was overlooking one thing. Apart from the aforesaid Junior League militia and some detached duty staff centurions, the revolutionaries in Africa had no armed force at all. As soon as the news hit town at the major base of Sirmium on the Danube, say the sources, Maximinus flew into a screaming and throwing things rage before getting repellently drunk for a day and a night. Apparently nobody really wanted to be around him after that, but as with today's autocrats, he had his ways of keeping the team together. Herodian, here's Herodian again, tells us that he assembled the army and said, among other things, but the fact is, and you gotta laugh when you hear it, that the Carthaginians have lost their minds and either persuaded or compelled a dopey old man with major cognitive impairments to accept the throne. It's like they're trolling the whole empire. What kind of an army have they got except for the proconsul's lictors? What kind of weapons have they got besides hunting spears? Wisecracks dancing and rhythmic posturing, by which he means parade square drill, are how they think they're trying for war. Maximinus then set out for Rome with battle groups from the Danube and Rhine armies and a large number of the Germans he had recruited in the surge 2.5 years later. And meanwhile, back in Africa, the situation went sideways in a hurry. In the next-door province of Numidia, modern Algeria, Governor Capelianus, a Maximinus appointee, had two things going for him. One major personal grudge against the Gordians, and one legion of regulars, 3 Augusta, based at Lambaesis and the only significant armed force between Alexandria and the Straits of Gibraltar. Capelianus mobilized the legion and headed straight for Carthage, where he wiped out Gordian II and an enthusiastic mob of junior leaguers just outside the city gates inside of an hour. Gordian I then hanged himself by his imperial belt. The attentat had lasted 6 weeks. Now, this put the Senate in something of a position. They had already sent dispatches to all of the provinces calling for revolution, but they wouldn't have expected any useful response for weeks or months. Their stalking horse was out of play, and they had a very large and angry Thracian coming down at them from the Danube with an army of real troops. Nominally, there was a Rome garrison, the Praetorians and 2 Parthica, but most of it was in theater under Maximinus's control and bearing down along with him. And then a miracle happened. The Senate actually got its act together for the first time in a century or two and began some very methodical organizing. Now, this may not be quite the surprise we'd think. By 238, many of the senior senators were retired generals with field experience and some idea how to run a campaign even against bad odds. They'd already nominated a board of 20 to administer the war effort for the Gordians. Now they elected 2 of the board, Balbinus and Pupienus, as emperors, declared Maximinus a public emperor again, or public enemy again, and began praying and or drinking heavily. 2 others of the board, Tullus Menophilus and Rutilius Crispinus, were already in the north trying to get a defense together. Pupienus was a very experienced military man. Balbinus was a very experienced civilian administrator. It seemed like an ideal combination, but they didn't get along. The mutual love of the emperor's slogan on their coins guarantees it. And the rumor was that they were both compromised choices anyway. The Republic had had moments like this, but it had been a while since then. A second miracle happened. Maximinus came down like the wolf on the fold on the city of Aquileia, at the head of the Adriatic, not far from where Trieste is now. But he came down without supplies. One of the things the imperial army was famous for, along with combat discipline, was logistics. But Maximinus seems to have pooched that segment of the course. His only actual Supreme Command experience, the looting expedition through Germany a couple of years before, probably convinced him that he could do the same thing inside the empire. He set out with a supply train, and he tried to pillage Emona, which is now Ljubljana, on his way, but the citizens weren't having it, and they took to the hills with all of their supplies. He then fetched up on the Isonzo River, found that the Aquileians had broken the bridge, and his northern troops were amazed that rivers south of the Alps didn't freeze. Eventually managed to get across, and then ravaged all of the crops in the vicinity, which didn't help his own logistics one bit. The Aquileians were extremely well supplied and organized. They shut their gates and prepared to resist to the death with professional management consulting from Crispinus and Monophilus, while Pupienus came north as far as Ravenna to help them out with whatever he could pull together from the Praetorians still in garrison, the city cohorts, the fire brigade, aka cops, and a German bodyguard he'd picked up at some point or other in his career. You know how these things happen, they just sort of come along. You now observe that we have Praetorians on both sides of the impending fracas, as well as a second-tier but substantial element still at Rome. Meanwhile, in Rome, the populace immediately revolted. They had no use for any of Balbinus, Pupienus, or the Senate itself, while apparently the Gordians had been well known and popular while they were living in Rome. We can only imagine what kind of backroom agitation was going on, and if we knew more about the Gordian family's African connections, we might have a better idea, because Herodian comments that the instigator was a senator from Carthage named Gallicanus. The people demanded that none other than the 13-year-old grandson of Gordian I, Marcus Antonius Gordianus Sempronius Romanus, be made co-emperor. The Senate caved in, and Gordian III was duly sworn in. That might have done the trick, but as Herodian tells the tale, some of the overaged Praetorians who had been left behind when Pupienus went north got curious and sneaked in under the tent at a sitting of the Senate. They were spotted, and since at this point most senators, out of an abundance of caution, were carrying something sharp, a panic brawl broke out in which some guardsmen were killed. That reignited the populace, who then got into a running fight with the Praetorians. And from here, for a while, we'll turn the story over to Herodian, who really digs this kind of stuff. Gallicanus persuaded the people to break into the public arsenals where parade armor rather than combat armor was stored, and if that isn't a sneer, I don't know what is. He threw open the gladiatorial schools and led out the gladiators armed with their regular weapons. Finally, he collected all the spears, swords, and axes from the houses and shops. The people, as if possessed, Herodian goes on, seized any tools they could find. They assembled and went out to the Praetorian camp, where they attacked the gates and walls as if they were actually organizing a siege. The Praetorians, with their vast combat experience, which may or may not be a sneer, protected themselves behind the shields and the parapet. Wounding their attackers with arrows and long spears, they kept them from the walls and drove them back. With evening approaching, the besiegers decided to retire since the civilians were exhausted and most of the gladiators were wounded. The people retreated in disorder, thinking that the few Praetorians would not dare to pursue so large a mob. But the Praetorians now threw open the gates and gave chase. They slaughtered the gladiators, and the greater part of the mob also perished, crushed in the confusion. After following the mob for a short distance, the Praetorians returned and remained inside the walls of the camp. And I thought we'd already done this. Well, we've done it now. If you look at this one, and you see that short stub of wall to the bottom left, that wasn't actually there at the time we're talking about. That's a part of the walls of Aurelian that were built in AD 270 to protect the city from impending barbarian invasions of any sort. But that meant that you could actually surround the Praetorian camp if you were able and willing. Herodian continues. Daily attacks were launched against the walls, but they accomplished nothing. Balbinus, who had remained in Rome, pleaded with the people to come to a truce and promised amnesty to the soldiers. But he failed to persuade either side. So huge a mob thought it disgraceful to be defied by a mere handful of men, and the Praetorians were enraged to be suffering these barbaric indignities at the hands of Romans. Finally, when the attacks on the walls made no progress, the generals decided that it would be a good strategy to overcome the soldiers by cutting off their water supply. They therefore diverted the flow of water into the camp, damming up the aqueducts which flowed under the walls. Recognizing the danger, the despairing Praetorians opened the gate and rushed forth to the attack. A sharp skirmish ensued, and when the mob fled, the guards pursued and drove them into all parts of the city. And this is the urban battle space that they were then confronting, the vertical urban battle space. Herodian goes on. Bested in the hand-to-hand fighting, the people climbed to the housetops and rained down upon the Praetorians tiles, stones, clay pots, and anything else they could get their hands on. In this way, they inflicted severe injuries upon the soldiers, who, being unfamiliar with the houses, did not dare to climb after them, and of course the doors of the shops and houses were barred. The soldiers then set fire to buildings that had wooden balconies, of which there were many in the city. Because so many buildings were made chiefly of wood, the fire spread very rapidly and without a break through most of the city. Many men who lost their vast and magnificent properties, valuable for the large incomes they produced and for their expensive decorations, were reduced from wealth unto poverty. A great many people died in the fire, unable to escape because the exits had been blocked by the fumes. All of the property of the wealthy was looted when the criminal and worthless elements in the city joined with the soldiers in plundering, and the part of Rome destroyed by fire was greater in extent than the largest other intact city in the empire. Herodian isn't totally clear about it, but the Praetorians apparently finally did surrender in their camp after the water was cut off. The episode gives a whole new meaning to the currently fashionable slogan, "Burn it all down!" and also reaffirms that massive retaliation can backfire seriously, since afterwards the people were more revolting than ever. Meanwhile, in the north, the Aquileians held out with high morale, and men, women, and children all on the ramparts. They held out long enough for serious hunger to set in among the besiegers, and for Second Parthica in particular to remember their wives and kids at Albanum. Parthica took the initiative, killed Maximinus, and established cool but correct relations with the city folk, who set up a market for them safely outside the walls. Pupienus sent the regular units home to their bases back on the frontier, and headed back to Rome with the metropolitan troops. And that should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. By then, he and Balbinus were no longer on speaking terms. The people were even more revolting. And finally, in June 238, the Praetorian Guard, who were all now back in town, swarmed the palace and terminated both of their regimes with extreme prejudice. The whole business had lasted just under 5 months. The implosion of AD 6970 had been called the Year of Five Emperors, so of course the year... never mind. So of course the year 238 went down in contemporary history as the year of 6 emperors. Apparently nobody had told the Romans this really wasn't a competition. But 238 marked the beginning of nearly 50 years of chaos, to the point where they just gave up counting, and part of the period between 238 and 285 is known simply as the 30 Tyrants. The Roman Empire that exchanged from the shambles was another kind of beast altogether. As for the boy emperor Gordian III, he lasted for 6 years with help from the adults in the Rome, and was apparently very well liked in the empire. He died under mysterious circumstances out east on the Euphrates during a campaign against the Persians. His successor, Philip the Arab, always claimed it was natural causes. And that is basically our story. I'm going to ask James to come up here and choose the questioners, since your eyes are better than mine, but I do see Mark had a hand up.
Yeah, I'd ask, was there any sort of relationship between the legions, the Praetorian Guard, and the general populace? Like here, we talk about consent to be policed and all this sort of thing. The relationship between the police and the the populace. Was there anything like that, or was it just along the lines of keep yourselves in line, or we're going to essentially cut you up?
Yeah, that's about that's a good summation. I mean, the Praetorians were not police. The Praetorians were cobblestone soldiers, and they were there to protect the emperor first, last, and always, except when they were personally getting rid of him. And no, there was no concept of consensual policing as we understand it. And if you want to see how fast consensual understanding turns into Praetorianism, keep watching for the next year. John?
Eric, the revolt seems to have started in Carthage, with knock-ons all the way over the deepest, darkest Danube. How long does it take to carry a message from Carthage to Rome, Rome to the Danube? I mean, the whole thing takes 5 months, 6 months.
Well, the whole thing took 5 months, but you can assume that every actor in this one had the fast courier service, so it would be at worst 2 weeks from Rome to the Danube. At worst. And actually, if you want to go to Orbis, which I've shown up there a couple of times, it's the Stanford University interactive map of the Roman Empire. It will tell you the travel time by fast courier. And they didn't have heliographs, so we can forget about that.
That question, did the Romans at that stage have complete sea control over that part of the Mediterranean?
Oh yes, it was still Mare Nostrum. It was their sea. It was their sea. Mike?
How did things come to restabilize? Was it great leadership or exhaustion or?
Yes. 50 years of anarchy, slightly less, because things started restabilizing. Well, after a couple of false starts, things restabilized when Diocletian took the throne in 285, and he invented a new system of government, basically, which was founded on a Persian style of distancing, and also he divided the empire in 4 pieces, along with a colleague, Augustus, and 2 Caesars, each working for the other one. So that's when you started seeing a territorial division, which didn't become permanent until 100 years later. Tony.
But didn't, if 385, you started to get stability, didn't the empire... 285, 285, pardon me, on the wrong section. My apologies.
Yes, get that right, Jim. But what are you going to ask?
Well, I was going to ask, I thought it was 385.
385 is when it all went to hell.
Years, and the whole empire implodes. They pull the troops out of Britain, they collapse.
Yeah, and things went downhill very fast after 378. Because you had the revolt of Maximinus from Britain in 383 or thereabouts, and then Theodosius takes the throne after Gratian has been killed in 383. Theodosius reunifies the empire shakily, but it's finally divided forever in 395. And 10 years after that, not only has the Rhine frontier been breached by the Alemanni and the Suebi and all kinds of other people like that, but Britain has been abandoned, and we start to see the Western Empire especially collapsing. It took 75 or 70 years for it to collapse, but it was collapsing.
Just another question. While all this was going on, were the Persians basically attempting to take advantage of this, or were they having their own fun and internal issues?
Well, in the 3rd century, which is nearest to the period we're talking about, the Persians raised hell in the east. They weren't ever able to destroy the empire in the east, but they took Antioch, they flattened it, they did their usual deportation of populations, but that's when Zenobia of Palmyra comes to the rescue, her and her family, and finally in 270 through 275, Aurelian puts it all back together in the east and flattens Palmyra in the process because they'd gotten too big for their boots.
Good.
I think we're good.
Yeah. Great. Well, Eric, that was terrific. Thank you so much.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.